wie lang kann man Daven Mincha? Bis wie lang kann man Daven Mincha? Bis wie lang kann man Daven Mincha? Oi Mincha. Bis wie lang kann man Daven Mincha? Bis wie lang kann man Daven Mincha? Bis wie lang kann man Daven Mincha? Oi Mincha.
Hello everyone. I hope and trust everyone is keeping well at this very, very critical time. Eliyahu Hanavi was indeed answered favorably in his tefillot at Mincha, and therefore we continue to go through Mincha scenarios, and as we spoke about the end time, now we're going to go to the earliest time to daven Mincha. Namely, what is the earliest time and proper time that you should daven Mincha? Should it be what we call Mincha Gedola, 12 and a half hours into the day, or no, should it be later in the day? And this comes down to the fundamental question of why do we daven Mincha? So as everybody knows, the Gemara says there are two reasons why we daven Shachris Mincha Ma'ariv. The first reason is Tfilot Avot Tiknum. Avraham instituted Shachris, Yitzchak instituted Mincha, and Yaakov instituted Ma'ariv. And based on that, we continue their tradition and daven every day as they did. However, the Gemara brings another point of view, and that is Tfilot Keneget Tmidim Tiknum. That it's patterned around the Korbanot. The Korban Tamid Shel Boker opened up business in the Beis HaMikdash. The Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim closed business. That's Shachris and Mincha. And at night, they burnt off various parts of the Korbanot that you can burn at night, called the Evarim and the Pedarim, and that's basically Ma'ariv. So at the end of the day, there's no real resolvement to this machloket, and the Gemara ends by saying, La'olam ei malach, always say, that Tfilot Avot Tiknum, that indeed our patriarchs instituted davening, but Asmichu Rabbanan Korbanot, but they patterned them around the sacrifices. Very nice historic machlokes. How does it relate to us? And the answer is, what's better? If we daven Mincha, patterned around the Korbanot, then there's no question that the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim was indeed once in a few years brought, called 6.5 hours into the day, midday plus a half an hour, and that was if an Erev Pesach came out on a Friday. If an Erev Pesach came out on a Friday, you had to barbecue your Korban Pesach before Shabbos, and therefore you needed more time. But on a regular Erev Pesach, it was brought much later, and on a regular day, it was brought much later. The Mishnah in Pesachim says, Tamid nishchat b'shmona umechza, v'karev b'teisha umechza. That at the end of the day, it was sacrificed at 9.5 hours into the day, what we call Mincha Ketana, namely later in the afternoon. And if indeed that's the reason we daven Mincha, then we should opt to try to daven Mincha at that time, not at an early minyan, but rather later into the day. Indeed, many poskim have taken this opinion. The Rambam, on top of them, basically says that yes, you can daven an early Mincha, but the proper time to daven is going to be what we call Mincha Ketana, 9.5 hours into the day. And therefore he's very explicit. Hamitpalel me'achar 6 sha'ot umechza yatsa. If indeed you daven at the early minyan, you fulfilled your obligation, because there once was a time that they brought the korban then, and Erev Pesach that came out on a Friday. But the proper time to daven is, and I quote, Tiknu zmana mitesha sha'ot umechza v'hinikret mincha ketana. The proper time to daven is going to be 9.5 hours into the day. Just in case you don't like my diuk, the Beit Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, says that according to the Rambam, Nirami Dvarav, Sheikar Takanat Zman Tfilat Mincha de Lechatchila, Umitesha Omechza Velamala, that the proper time to daven is going to be 9.5 hours into the day. And only if you have no choice, then you can daven what's called a Mincha Gedola. In his words, Mincha Gedola Shamru, Hainu Lomar, Shemit Palel Tfilat Mincha Mishigia Oto Sha'a, Yatza Yedei Chovato. Namely, you fulfilled your obligation, but not optimal. So once again, if we go by the Korbanot model, and that's the reason we daven Mincha, then the best time to daven will be 9.5 hours into the day. On your app, that's called Mincha Ketana. That's the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins, Mishit Palel, Lachar, 6 sha'ot umechza v'lamala yotza, v'ikar zmana, mitesh sha'ot umechza v'lamala. Best time, 9.5 hours, but if you daven at an early mincha, you have fulfilled your obligation. However, let's take the other point of view in the pattern davening based on the patriarchs. Then there's no difference between Mincha Gedola and Mincha Ketana. There was no sacrifice brought on this time or on that time, and therefore, from this perspective, the Gemara says explicitly in Maseches Yoma that Slute de Avraham Mekim Meshachrei Kotlei. Avraham eventually went ahead and instituted Shachris, but then his son instituted Mincha, and he Daven Mincha. When did he Daven Mincha? When the wall started to get a little darker. Rashi explains, and I quote, Tfilat ha'erev shelo Mekim Meshachrei Kotlei u'bitchilat sheva sha'ot. Me'ahi shata notim tzadalei erev v'karui erev. Namely, 6.5 hours into the day, or the beginning of the 7th hour, is the time that the sun starts going the other way. Namely, if you go by the model of the patriarchs, there's no difference between Mincha Gedola and Mincha Ketana. The Rosh actually paskins this, La halacha, Tfilat Mincha Zmana, Mechina Tutzilei Erev, Dahainu Mivav Sha'ot U'Mechza V'Lamala. And he quotes our Gemara in Yoma to prove it. Namely, if we go by the patriarchs, Mincha Gedola, that Mincha in the afternoon, early afternoon, is no difference than Mincha. And indeed, the Tur, the son of the Rosh, Paskins, Uzbanami Sheshot U'Mechza V'Lamala. He doesn't say that you're supposed to daven later, but rather, like his father, the time is from 6.5 hours into the day, and the Beit Yosef indeed goes ahead and makes it explicit by saying, U'midivrei Rabbeinu Nireh, from the words of the Torah, it seems clear, is Man Mincha Lechatchila, the proper time to daven Mincha, ideally, what we call the early Mincha, Mincha Gedola. Namely, that if you go by the patriarch model of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or in this case, Yitzchak, you ultimately have no difference between an early Mincha and a late Mincha. And indeed, the Mishnah Berurah says, Yesh meharishonim shemikilin lechatchila misheshot u'mechza v'lamala. There are many Rishonim that say this is as optimal as a later time. How do we paskin on this shaila? It seems to be a machlokas Rishonim, and even though the Shulchan Aruch took a point of view of the Rambam, I can't ignore that one of the poskim of the Shulchan Aruch is the Rosh, and he disagrees, and therefore the Mishnah Berurah basically says, anytime you have an excuse, you can definitely lechatchila daven mincha early. Al kol panim rotzeh lechol. There's certain restrictions of eating before mincha, or rotzeh latzeit laderech. You're about to go out on a long drive. Oh, shatay yachol litpalel limatzibor, and right now there's a minyan, and you can passing by a minyan. Ve'im yamtin lo yuyelu minyan, and maybe if you wait, you won't have a minyan later. Lechulei alma mutar litpalel lechatchila mishei shotu mechza v'lamala. And indeed, I would say today there is no difference in Am Yisrael. There's a machlokas Rishonim. Definitely, the Rambam prefers a later time, as does the Shulchan Aruch. But there are the Rosh and many other Rishonim that say, listen, at the end of the day, we have the patriarch model, we have the korbanot model. We can't decide. The Gemara didn't decide, and therefore both times seems to be 100% legitimate. If you want to be machmir, then be machmir if you have a choice. But any time you have an excuse, it's lechatchila to daven at the early.